folks. Greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. Today, I have myself, Spencer, and Daniel Perkins on the show in the episode today. And Daniel is Information Security Officer here at Secure IT 360. I'm going to let him introduce himself in a moment. But I first wanted to touch on the episode, what we're going to be talking about, and then we'll dive into Daniel's background and kind of dive into the subject. So today's topic is vulnerability management. We kind of wanted to do a deep dive. We kind of wanted to talk about the inner workings and kind of the best practices and the fundamentals of vulnerability management. I think collaboration and teamwork and tracking and monitoring and KPIs and staying up to date and all those things, there's a lot of stuff that's involved with vulnerability management that we're going to talk about. And that's what we want to talk about today. So I think that would bring value to those who are listening. And hopefully this is an insightful conversation for you all. So without further ado, Daniel, why don't you tell us about yourself, what you do, where you come from? You're from Colorado, so hopefully you have some snow. I'm from New York, and we don't have any snow yet, but it's cold. So typical New York winter so far.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's mid-December when we're recording this, so not quite as much snow as I would like, but we're getting there. But thanks for having me on today, Spencer. I appreciate the chance to chat with you and your audience. My name's Daniel Perkins. Like Spencer said, I'm a Senior Information Security Officer here at Secure IT 360. Lived near Denver for a few years now. I used to live in Charlotte, North Carolina area before that. Little background professionally for me. Like most of us first-gen cybersecurity folks, started in IT help desk and moved up into IT management, and eventually found my way into cybersecurity. The first kind of big major project I had, which was really just off to the races, was, hey, Daniel, we need our company to be ISO 27001 certified. Cool. When do you need that by? Oh, well, like 3 months ago. I'm like, okay, well, let's get after this. And but with some time and some help from other professionals, was able to get our firm at the time ISO certified. But other than that, got my MBA in 2017. I've got a CISSP, CISM, CISA, and SC risk, all after my name. I've been doing this for a little over 20 years, been at Security 360 for since 2021. And as far as what I do, I'm in our consulting side, our virtual CISO side. So I work with a lot of our clients on building their programs out around risk management. Of course, one of those elements is around vulnerability management. And that even goes back to what I had to do in my first role with getting that ISO certification was, part of that is how do you identify, assess, and treat vulnerabilities in your environment? So been doing this for some time around vulnerability management, small clients that we serve all the way up to, kind of where I started, which was multinational, doing with multiple geographic areas, multiple IT teams that are patching systems, all the way down to, hey, we've got one IT guy who's doing the work right. So, so that's a little bit about me.
Awesome. Yeah, great. And I know, you come from an environment that was your previous environment is fairly large, right? I think, you mentioned a multinational organization. It's a pretty large environment, right?
Yeah, it was. I mean, we had, I want to say about 10,000 users across the globe. So it was very large. And it was, parts of it were centralized and we had elements of the team that were working centrally, but we also had, as you can imagine, a lot of disparate. Like we had silos and we had different orgs and trying to really bring everybody up to this same standard because, with ISO and with vulnerability management, we've got, which we'll probably talk about in a moment, we've got a lot of demands internally and externally about how we do vulnerability management. So it's kind of really getting everybody on a cohesive strategy that we can really go and say, we do vulnerability management well.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned something I think it probably resonates with everyone listening, right? Silos. If that doesn't scream or if that doesn't say IT and IT security, I'm not sure if there's a better word for that. So, but vulnerability management, right? So it's what we're here to chat about. So what is vulnerability management to you? What does it encompass? What does it entail? Let's set some baselines so we're on the same page with everyone.
Yeah, so it's a great question. And it just so happens I did a recent webinar on this. And what I kind of did to kind of tee up what is vulnerability management, I kind of asked two AIs, hey, well, how do you define vulnerability management? And there's a couple of things that kind of popped out to me. first good news for us humans, both AIs said, hey, you still need humans involved, right? You have to do these things with humans. But to sum it down, it's basically a continuous life cycle of identifying what assets you have, identifying what vulnerabilities those assets have, assessing those vulnerabilities and assessing those assets for criticality, and then doing remediation and mitigation steps. What I want to be, what I see a lot of clients, and we'll talk about this, is it's not patch compliance, right? This is vulnerability management, it's vulnerability risk management. We're not just looking at, hey, did all these machines get all these patches? We're looking at things that maybe there is no patch for, right? And so you can't patch against a vulnerability that's out there. So it's that cohesive, comprehensive look at everything in your environment, not just endpoints and servers, especially with the cloud. Right now, we've got a lot of our workloads out in the cloud, and those systems have varying degree of vulnerability management from whatever infrastructure you're hosting on to things that you have to do yourself, kind of those user entity controls where, yeah, AWS and Azure, they're going to stand up the infrastructure for you. But if you drop a server on that, hey, good luck with that. That's what Azure and AWS will tell you, that, hey, we're not responsible for patching those. That's you as the client.
Yeah, and those are a lot of challenges that people are faced with. And that's something we see in the offensive security group too when we do penetration testing.
Sure.
We are kind of intentionally or we are directly involved in that vulnerability management process, right? Penetration testing is an input to a vuln management program.
Absolutely.
And, a lot of times we see there be confusion of what vulnerability management is and what it isn't. So maybe, kind of going off script a little bit, just talk about the differences between like patch management and vulnerability management, how those two might be different and how you need both and they're important, kind of things like that.
Yeah. So when I think about vulnerability management, it's really that exposure I've got, right? What things can somebody like Spencer, who's hopefully on my side, can he take advantage of to exploit my system and gain access and elevate privileges and start owning my environment? So when I think about patch management, that's more of pretty rote metrics of, hey, I've got 1,000 machines and they're all at this patch level, this version, this KB, this cumulative update, right? And it's, while they are similar and they do work hand in hand, certainly we need good patch management to do vulnerability management well, because if I'm doing good patch management, my vulnerability management is that much easier because I'm not having to deal with maybe just the baseline of, hey, are all these machines up to this cumulative update? And so the difference for me is really that things that can't be patched, right? That's where we've got risks that often with our clients that we see where it kind of falls through the cracks, right? Of it's not just a patch, right? One that we see a lot is this unquoted service path extension, right? There's no patch for that. It really just requires hands-on keyboard. What I like to say, is somebody's got to just get in and fix that, right? There's no just do a patch at the wall, do a version upgrade, whatever it is to remediate this. And so that for me is the difference, right? It's that risk-based exposure is where we're looking at for vulnerability management, whereas patch compliance is more of just, hey, do all these machines, are they up to date? Do they have the functions and features that we're after? And so what we work through with our clients is, hey, let's move that more towards risk-based approach. What assets do we have? What vulnerabilities? What exposure do we have? And really sorting those assets with vulnerability management, right? With patch management, patch compliance is really just, I don't really care what criticality they had to my environment. They all got to be patched up. Whereas with vulnerability management, I definitely got tier one critical assets, right?
Yeah.
Those I've got to keep a good watch on and make sure the exposure is as closed off as I can, making sure that people like Spencer can't get in and exploit those devices. But maybe I've got other environments, a dev environment, something that has low criticality data. That's a lower tier for me. I'm not as concerned about that. So it's for me, it's getting that risk-based approach is really the focus for me with vulnerability management.
Yeah, and you mentioned assets and you mentioned different tiers and different environments, different segments. One of the things that I think is important, and you touched on and kind of alluded to, is your assets, right? So what are some of the prerequisites you need for a good vulnerability management program? Looking at the CIS, step number one is know your assets, right? And we all preach that. It's a block and tackling, but what are some of the prerequisites you need before you can just go do vulnerability management?
Right. Well, I'm a CISO, right? Virtual CISO. So, obviously, where I would want to start is policy, right? What do we say we're going to do, and how are we going to do it, right? But that can be a bit nebulous, and that'll be very different for your organization from mine. But the idea here is to set some basic goals and targets, what we're going to do, and why it's important to us. That's what I kind of think about a policy level. Then we're going to get into practice, and that's kind of the how, the when that we're going to do things, right? So first step for me is really I've got to get a good baseline of my assets and understand what I've got. And again, that can't just be endpoints and servers. We got to think of our environment cohesively, right? And so, where do we have cloud assets? Where do we have workloads, servers, switches, firewalls, any networking gear of the day, IoT, OT, all of that is part of my vulnerability management program, because any of those can have an exposure or a risk associated that could be taken advantage of. And that can even be, as much as I hate to say it, we talk to folks from time to time like, oh, well, that's behind this other firewall and it's in this segment at VLAN and we've got good ACLs on it. Friend, that's great. And fantastic job that you've done all that. But I'm sure, as you would second as well, is that an exposure can be exploited from anywhere. And it doesn't matter how many layers of network I've got between that asset and the outside world. If it's something that just requires a user interaction to be exploited, it doesn't matter where that user interaction comes from. Now we've got a foothold and somebody can take advantage of it. So knowing your assets is really critical for me. We come into environments from time to time and we'll do a scan and we'll say, hey, we got 100 devices back from your scan. And I'll ask the client, how many assets do you have in your environment? Oh, we've got 250. I'm like, oh, friend, we've got a big gap between what we're scanning versus what you have. I can't, with good confidence, say this is your entire exposure, right? So the other part of that with assets is, of course, you want to get to as close as you can to 100% coverage. But the other part is getting kind of high quality scan data, right? Getting those authenticated scans, getting a little deeper dive look into your assets. Somebody like you as a pen tester, probably a lot of what you see is just kind of superficial, unauthenticated scan data. Maybe it's running a web server, maybe it's got RDP, which that shows kind of an attack surface. But what we need to understand is what's the exposure after I know my attack surface, right? And that's where that vulnerability authenticated scan data comes in, because now I can see a full picture of what might be exploitable on my machine. Maybe it can or can't be based on the criticality and that vulnerability. But without getting that high quality authenticated scan data, I don't have the full picture and I can't fully protect and secure my environment without that picture.
Yeah. And you mentioned risk and you mentioned, getting authenticated scans, right? And getting to kind of the root cause of those things, figuring out once we go beyond the initial attack surface, what's the impact of those things? So what do you think are some strategies to assess the risk of those vulnerabilities, right?
Sure.
You've done your prerequisites, you've set up good inventory, what you're trying to identify vulnerabilities in.
Yeah.
How do you assess the risk, the impact? How do you prioritize that stuff? What are some strategies for people listening for that?
Yeah. So I like anybody else, I always start with a CVSS score, right? That's just a baseline. It's an industry standard. We all have a good understanding of what that means. But at the same time, that's not my only metric or my only measure that I use to rank a vulnerability that may be present. So I kind of start with the CVSS and say, okay, what's the criticality based on that? Is it a 10? Is it a 7? Is it 8? Whatever, right? But there's a few other things I look for. The one that I often look for is, is this known to be exploitable? Like, is somebody like Spencer going to be actually able to take this and run with it and use it to leverage something in my environment? Or is this something that was academic and it was released in a white paper, and the chance that this could actually be exploited in my environment are fairly low, right?
So, a good example is the unquoted service pass you just mentioned versus something like a TLS 1.0 vulnerability. Right? Academic, TLS, unquoted service pass, something I use all the time on pen tests to elevate my privileges, right? Absolutely. So it's a perfect example that you mentioned just earlier.
Yeah, so that's something I'm looking at too. So I start with CVSS. I look for, is it known exploitable? And then to follow up on that, okay, if it is known exploitable, how does somebody like a Spencer or an attacker leverage it, right? Um, the ones I'm less concerned about are the ones I see where, hey, you've got to have physical access to this device to exploit this. You've got to load a bootloader on it or something, or get access to the kernel. I'm like, okay, yes, certainly bad, but the chance of a user getting into that environment are slim to none, right? Um, Now, if it's more something, low user interaction or remote code executable, those are going to get bumped up a little higher for me. And I'm going to look at those and say, okay, I've got an RCE or low user interaction to exploit this. That's going to get it elevated up for me. And of course, last, like we just talked about, what assets are affected, right?
Mhm.
If it's a low concern, dev system that has no critical personal data on it, probably not as concerned about it as I am maybe a if I've got an example of CVSS 10 that's got a physical access on this dev server that nobody, I've got a very good access control around it. I'm probably less concerned from that versus maybe a public facing web server that's got a CVSS 8 that is exploitable. I'm probably going to focus on that first because that's something that maybe my clients or customers can see.
Mhm.
Maybe there's the risk of is low of getting anything confidential or personal data off that public facing server, but certainly reputationally, right? If my clients come back to me and say, hey, Daniel, we observed that this server had a vulnerability on it, or maybe worse, maybe somebody took advantage of it, defaced my website, or started crypto mining off of it, or something bad, or injecting ransomware into my clients and customers. Um, those are the things I want to wait over something that's harder to exploit, is protected versus something I've got public facing that maybe has a lower exploitability factor, or that I think what do you call it, the skill level, right? The skill
Mhm.
floor. If it's a very high skill floor to take advantage of something, um, probably a little less concerned. Of course, I want to take care of it and assess it and get it mapped out into my remediation schedule, but it may be a little bit lower down in my priority.
Yeah, and something you mentioned I think is important is, the whole goal of doing this is prioritization, right? There's so many
Yeah,
vulnerabilities that these scanners
absolutely.
find, right? There's so
Hmm.
many inputs to your vulnerability management program. You can't
Yep.
possibly get to them all. And
No.
I'm
Okay.
and I'm famously or maybe unfamously quoted as saying like 99% of vulnerabilities in your environment don't matter. And,
Hmm.
the point of my saying that was, a lot of the vulnerabilities are never going to hurt you in
Sure.
a real material way.
Right.
And the goal of this, I think that, and that's what you're alluding to, is the goal is to get to the ones that are bad, that can
Yeah.
hurt you,
Hmm.
that are badness in your environment, weed
Yeah.
those out, assess them and prioritize them, get rid of them, so
Yeah.
that you're focusing your hard earned time and your
Yes.
limited time.
Yeah.
And many people are wearing many hats,
Sure.
focusing that time on the most important ones.
Yeah. I see that all the time, like especially in larger environments where we've got thousands of assets, right? We see this analysis paralysis. And what I've seen teams struggle with is security, whoever doing the vulnerability scanning will send over just here's a list of a bazillion criticals and highs we need patched. And our policy says you've got to patch these in 3 days' time. Um, and it just becomes it's analysis paralysis. Nobody can do anything. They're
Mhm.
just so focused on this list they can't actually start attacking it and getting after it. So yeah, really getting that prioritization around first your assets and then what's the criticality of this vulnerability in my environment really helps you needle it down. And so then you can have a more constructive collaborative conversation with your IT friends or the teams that are doing the mitigation or mediation to say, okay, our policy says this 3 days time. What's actually realistic for you? Can you do this in 3 days, or how much time do you need? Right. And often, if the team understands that and everybody's on the same collaborative environment, the patch times that we can see can be acceptable. Right. They may not meet that 3 day, but uh, often we've done the assessment within 3 days time. We've kind of issued the workout. We're tracking against it. Um, but it's really, yeah, you can't just throw a list of 1,000 criticals and highs in an IT
Yep.
team and expect them to come back next month with everything
Yep.
mitigated. And the other thing that we see with this from time to time is they will send over a list from everything that dropped on Patch Tuesday, right? And we know with IT friends, they've got testing rings as they're doing their patch compliance and patch management.
Mhm.
If you send over a list from vulnerabilities that just dropped Tuesday on a Wednesday right after it, uh, our IT friends haven't even probably even downloaded the list yet and looked at
Mhm.
it and figured out how we're going to release and test these, right? So
Yep.
give them a little bit of time to work through the list. And a lot of vulnerability management too, it's a bit in arrears, right? We kind of look at last month's data to see what got missed, right? We're doing that
Mhm.
trust and verify. We trust patch management to work, but we need to also verify it. So a lot of the stuff that we're seeing, it's effectively last month's data, right? It's last
Mhm.
month's cumulative update that didn't get applied on these machines. But it's tricky because now we're blending into is this a vulnerability issue, management issue that we didn't assess it properly? Or is this a patch management, patch compliance issue of, hey, these machines just didn't get applied this patch? Um, and they're both are true. They're not mutually exclusive, right?
Mhm.
We still have these vulnerabilities present because these cumulative updates did not get applied, but it's up to the patch management teams to kind of identify what didn't go correct on those machines and get those implemented.
And how important is that collaboration, right, amongst the teams? A
Mm-hmm.
lot of times we see with vulnerability management, I'm going to take a piece of paper and just like it's tossed over the fence,
Oh,
right? You
sure.
take the
Yeah.
paper and it's tossed over
Mm-hmm.
the fence.
Yep.
Um, how important do you think is collaborating amongst the teams and kind of working together, communicating
Yep.
with the various teams, business units, et
Yeah. Yeah.
cetera?
Mm-hmm.
How important is that, and what are some advice you have for that?
Yeah, I mean, coming from IT days, right? What's the focus for IT? Keep things online, keep things running. What's the focus for a security guy like myself now? Get things patched, get them secure, right? At times, those can be a bit at odds, right? Especially, we've got business mandates, we've got projects, we've got deadlines, we've got clients that need to get served. There's a lot of variables there, and if you're operating in this bubble of I'm just looking at my scanner logs, I'm just looking at what my reports, my dashboards are throwing at me without having that business context, um, nobody's going to be happy at the end of the day
Mhm.
because security is going to be pushing to, hey, let's close this vulnerability. IT is going to say, fine, I'll close it, but I need to do it after this deadline or this project or this deliverable or this holiday weekend or this, I'm going to get it in the next maintenance window. And then you even have like, business demands, right? Hey, we're trying to bring on this client. We've got to meet these things, even down to uh, our clients contractually require us to mitigate and remediate vulnerabilities. So we can't be too far behind,
Mhm.
especially if they come asking. I'm sure you've seen this, Spencer. We see this from time to time where a new zero day will pop, right? And everybody gets the news of it. And then what immediately happens after that? Everybody's third party risk management kicks off. And now all of a sudden we're getting emails. Hey, what are you doing for this vulnerability? How are you mitigating this new CVE? And so we've got to have in vulnerability management a good understanding of okay, what's realistic for us to actually get this patched? What are my
Mhm.
client requirements? Maybe I've got regulatory requirements too. If I'm working in a critical infrastructure, right? I've got to pay attention to the CISA known exploited vulnerability list and get those patched as close as I can to those deadlines, or maybe even beat those deadlines. But there's a lot of variables. And as much as security would just like to patch all the things and bring it down and we'll bring it back up afterwards, it's not realistic. Um, you know, Security doesn't exist without the business and the firm. Same thing with IT. So we've got to find a balance. And I would encourage folks to get a good cadence with some of maybe your friendly stakeholders and just say, hey, we've got all these demands, right? We've got these risk exposures, we've got these client requirements. Um, how do we find a way to get the best compromise, right? Of hey, we're going to patch as soon as we can. Maybe we've got a standing maintenance window, third week of the month, as an example, and so we're going to line up everything to go with that. But the other side of that is, well, your client's going to say, well, you got to patch it within 3 days' time of this 0 day. Okay, well, maybe we have an emergency maintenance window. Sometimes, if these clients come with these demands of patch this on this schedule, sometimes you can get away with just saying, hey, we've assessed this. We've got it queued up in our patch management, in our vulnerability management cycle. We're going to get to it on this date. And often that's sufficient for a lot of clients. They'll accept that and say, okay, you're not just dragging your heels, you're not sitting on your hands.
Mhm.
You're assessing it based on the risk of exposure, and you've got a plan to mitigate that vulnerability. So I'm going to accept it and move on and deal with this other,
Yeah.
vendor of mine who's not even responding to my email.
And that gets into, yeah, and that gets into another great point is that, what gets measured, what gets monitored gets measured,
Sure.
right? And I think we're all, putting our CISO hats on,
Yeah.
our leadership hats on. I
Yep.
think we can all agree that measuring things is a good way to figure out if my program is working, if
Right.
things are getting
Mhm.
done,
Mhm.
if I need to change things up, if it's not
Sure.
working, are there problems? So
Yeah.
what are some ideas for kind of tracking, measuring, monitoring, putting that
Yeah.
leadership hat on and saying, is
Yep.
this working? Are we being effective at what we're doing and how we're spending our time?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So some of the common KPIs that we see, right? They're fairly rudimentary or basic, and they're good measures. But how many criticals and eyes do you have in your environment, right? Uh, Maybe another one is what's the age of the vulnerabilities? Are these from 30 days old? Are these 90 days old? Are we see it all the time? Are these multiple years old? We still got things hanging out in our environment. Um, but there's a couple that I like to use when I'm working with a client, or even if it were my own environment. And this goes kind of back to our first point of like, how much am I actually scanning? If I know I've got 250 or 2,500 or 10,000 uh, devices or assets in my environment, how many of those am I actually getting scanned? And how many of those am I getting high quality authenticated scans on, right? Am I getting 9,000 and I've got 10,000? Okay, I have a pretty good, I've got 90% of my assets coverage. I'd want to get it to 100%, and I would start working towards that. Um, Another that I like to track is how many exceptions am I getting, right? How many things, as we're discussing with the business, or we're discussing with IT, of like, uh, we can't patch this because of this client requirement, or we can't patch this because we don't have a patch from the vendor, or we can't patch this because this is a real story. I don't want to touch it because if I touch that device, it might break and not come back online. And that's a different CISO conversation about availability and integrity. But so how many assets do I have? How many exceptions am I getting per month? And for these, I'm looking for trends, right? I'm not going to try to focus on individual cases, or maybe specific vulnerabilities that have come out. I want to look for trends, right? I want to look for, am I trending up, getting close to that 100% coverage? Am I trending with the exceptions, like I'm getting more every month, or maybe it's a specific vendor or asset class, or maybe a specific team that's asking for exceptions, like, hey, I don't know, maybe collaboration just doesn't want to patch anything because they don't want to take their codecs down in the conference rooms. So, looking for those trends over times, over really months and quarters, not so much, every week or every month. I want to kind of average these out and get some sort of trend line associated. And that's kind of where that monthly cadence comes back in, right? We want to look at these probably at least monthly, because we're always having Patch Tuesday come out with new things
Mm.
dropping every month. Um, I like monthly, maybe quarterly is the right schedule for your organization. But knowing how often these patches come out, monthly is generally the right cadence.
Yeah. And, you know, all these vulnerabilities, right? We
Mhm.
mentioned it earlier that there's thousands of vulnerabilities,
Sure.
and you might look at your vulnerability scan data and be like, deer in the headlights, right?
Yeah.
Shocked. Like there's
Yeah.
just so many.
Hmm.
What
Hmm.
are some of your ideas, or what are some of the ways that you like to kind of stay up to speed, right, on
Yeah.
some of the more important ones? Or like, how do I know if I'm a CISO at an organization,
Hmm.
what ones are important, or what ones are in the news maybe that I should focus on, and things like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And there's a couple different elements to this. One is a CISO. When I look at the actual data that's coming out of my scanner, of course, I'm looking for what is the resolution, right? Is it just throw a patch at it? But I'm also keying in on, um, hey, what needs a configuration change? And maybe that goes back to if I see a lot of that, it could mean that maybe I've got a breakdown in my change management. Maybe we're introducing changes in our environment that maybe didn't get a security review, or maybe they're not following best practice. So that will be one thing as far as staying up to date on what's in my environment. As far as getting kind of up to date, there's so many blogs and websites that publish this stuff, but honestly, a lot of good data can come from whatever scanner you're using. We leverage Nessus a lot in our environment, and they've got a fairly good cycle for publishing new vulnerabilities and plugin data. But I mean, honestly, Rapid7, Qualys, all of those vendors, they've got very robust and timely publications for when things drop. There is a couple of webinars that I like to watch. Avanti does actually a very good kind of wrap up for the monthly drops, and even in between what came between Patch Tuesdays. They're not a partner of ours, but Avanti, they've got a very robust webinar that they do, and they kind of talk about all the things that are hitting this month. And of course, if you're in highly regulated, it's critical infrastructure. CISA, right? They have their known exponent vulnerability list. They're updating that regularly. But as far as what I'm focusing on of what to hit to my teams, I often key in on, okay, what's not just a patch and forget? What's not just a version upgrade? What do I actually have to have my IT friends get hands on keyboard and focus that effort on? And those are kind of things I'm looking for too in these vulnerabilities when they get announced is, if the remediation is just a patch, okay, I probably have good patch management. I know my team's going to handle that. But if it's something that, hey, maybe there is no patch, I've got to do some sort of compensating control, look for IOCs, maybe I'm going to drop those into my environment and kind of ramp up resources. And you've seen it too, Spencer, where often these things will drop and it's a new 0 day. Oh, but the patch was released 6 months ago. I'm like, okay, well, am I really concerned about that, or am I concerned about something maybe more critical?
Yeah, exactly. So closing thoughts for everybody listening,
Yep.
for people who maybe don't have a very robust vulnerability management program, or maybe people who do have a vulnerability management program, but they're looking for ways to kind of improve, or anything in between. What are your, top 1, 2, 3 pieces of advice for people who are listening to either do it better or to start doing it or to kind of just level up a little bit?
Yeah, it's kind of a little bit of the reverse of kind of what do I need to start with. From a security practitioner, really the first thing for me is know your assets, know what you've got out there, right? You can't protect what you don't know about, and you can't fix something that you can't find, right? And so really go through your environment and make sure you're getting everything scanned and you're getting good, high quality authenticated data from all those assets. After that, you certainly want to rank those assets, right? Not all these things are equal. Some assets are going to be more critical to you than others. Maybe they've got personal confidential data on them. And so we've got to do maybe keep an extra eye on those, make sure we're very aware of what's occurring on those devices. The other part after that is really back to my CISO roots. Let's make sure policy matches practice, right? If we say on paper we're going to do 3-day remediations or 3-day assessment timelines, let's make sure we're hitting that, and that's realistic. Get that collaboration and communication with your IT friends, with your business sponsors, with those system owners, making sure that what we're going to put on paper we can actually do. When we have clients come in and they ask, how do we do vulnerability management? We're going to give them our policy, right? We want to make sure that that matches as close as it can to our reality. And where we've got exceptions, we have well-documented justifications or reasons why we've got exceptions for those. So yeah, really know what you've got. Make sure you got good coverage. Make sure you assign some criticality or tiering to those assets. And then really that communication collaboration to make sure what you say in your policy matches your practice.
That's great. Thank you, Daniel, so much for coming on the show and sharing your experience, your wisdom. I hope this was an insightful episode for everyone. So Daniel, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Spencer.
So that's all the time we've got for you today. Thank you everybody for listening and or watching if you're checking this out on YouTube. We do this as our job. You know, we help organizations with vulnerability management and vCISO work and everything else in between. And so if that's something that interests you and you want to hear more about that, you can find us at securit360.com. And also, while you're at it and browsing the web, check out offsec.blog. Check out our LinkedIn and our websites. And we post a lot of blogs, we post a lot of videos and content, and share our expertise on LinkedIn and on our website as well. So we try to put out a lot of free information to help people level up and improve their vulnerability management programs and everything in between. So I hope you got value from this episode. We release new episodes every Wednesday, so be free to check us out, subscribe, like, and comment, and all that fun stuff that the algorithm likes to help us reach more people. And we will see you in the next episode.
All right. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.